So yeah, with that, we're going to kick things off with James Brown, the founder and miller behind Barton Springs Mills. And so I'll let him take it away. But thanks again for coming and sharing your story with us as we celebrate, 75 years as a club. So take it away.
Thank you, Angel, and happy birthday to the group. That's awesome. 75 years. That's something to be very proud of.
Thank you.
The way I normally do these things is I'll give a general background about the mill, what we do, why I was so moved to do this activity, and then leave enough time for questions, because usually the discussion goes in very interesting ways, and I can everybody's got lots of questions, so I'm happy to do that. So I'll give a general outline, and then call for questions, and I have the chat window open, so I'm monitoring that, and I'll interweave those as we go, if that's all right. In around 2016, my wife and I started having talks about what we would like to do in retirement. My wife has worked for the state her entire career, and she's eligible next year for retirement if she so chooses to take it. And so I've spent my entire life as a classical musician, mostly working in the church as a church music director, and also specializing in early music, which means I work most evenings and weekends. And so the discussion started centering on when she retired, would I be retiring, and what we would do in retirement, because now in the modern age of retiring, first of all, we live a lot longer, and two, none of us has enough money. So we take on second careers or pursue passion projects. And I'd already been toying a lot with, I've been baking a lot of bread, making a lot of pizza, and was starting to decide that maybe one of those activities might be something that would interest me in retirement. If you've seen the explosion of pizzerias in Austin in the last 3 years, it's a bit ridiculous. I think there's pretty much, pizzerias now outnumber Starbucks 3-1. One of the things during my hobbyist baking was that I was getting more into wanting to bake with whole grains, and also with ancient grains and landrace and heritage or heirloom grains, and started looking for where I might be able to find those, to find that there were very few options nationwide, much less within the state of Texas, with the exception of an Anabaptist community just outside of Waco that's doing some stone milling on a water-powered mill that they brought from Vermont and rebuilt. There were no other sources for stone milled grain within the state, and nobody was really working with landrace grains, ancient grains. So that's where the idea to start the mill sprung to life. Started doing a lot of research, spent a fair amount of time at the University of Washington in Mount Vernon, Washington, where they have the grain school led by one of the nation's preeminent wheat breeders, and where they have a repository, a fairly healthy repository of seed stocks. And then went and did a few what we call stages, or lengthy visitations at Hayden Mills and just outside of Phoenix, and Griston Toll in Pasadena, California, perhaps the only so labeled urban flour mill right in the heart of downtown Pasadena, California. And then from that determined that my model wouldn't copy either of those, but be something unique to our place and time here in the Austin area in Central Texas. Then a lot of my questions, once I determined that I wanted to be stone milling in a very traditional way, and making these ancient processed flours as they would have been done hundreds of years ago, was what were we going to grow, and how were we going to set about doing that? And the first thing I did was I found something called the 1919 wheat classification. It was the first report of its kind that was conducted in tandem with the census, that went state by state and cataloged numbers of acres of wheat grown and the wheat varieties that were grown. And so I thought that was an excellent touchstone in looking for varieties that perhaps we could still locate and grow and repatriate to Texas. And so we settled on 6 varieties of hard red winter wheat and 1 variety of soft white wheat, or soft red wheat, no, soft white wheat, excuse me. And then identified some others that we could not find seed stocks for. And we were fortunate to apply and be accepted to make withdrawals from the Gene Plasm Bank and start with 100 grams of an additional 8 varieties that we went through very controlled grow outs of these varieties using the method of wheat intensification that was adapted and developed by Cornell University for getting the most seed return from a seed stock investment, namely treating these wheat plants like shrubs rather than row crops, and treating them in a way that gave us the most number of tillers or additional heads of wheat so that we could accelerate our grow out. And so now we've finished our 3rd harvest this past June. I'm happy to report that those 8 varieties, we now have about 2 tons of wheat from each of those varieties. We'll now go into broad agricultural application of those and have those available next June for people to purchase and to make bread from, and also to acquire seed stock if they want to grow those out. We specialize in the milling of wheat and rye, corn, and buckwheat. I had to find farmers that were willing to grow these varieties that have not been tested this century. And there's always some concern about disease pressures, pest pressures, the fact that these are tall stature grain varieties as opposed to modern hybridized varieties that are very short in stature. So there's also issues of lodging, that is to say, the crops blowing over. So finding farmers who are willing to take those chances and who are also certified organic was a fairly laborious task. I stumbled onto a website called the Agrilicious website, which somebody had the sense to put together a website, offer farmers a web presence in the form of one single page to say, my name's Farmer John, and I'm an organic farmer, or I'm a conventional farmer, and I grow these things. If you want organic wheat, here's my email address and here's my telephone number, call me. And I identified, I think it was 30 farmers on that list that grew grain organically. And I called all 30 of those, and of those 30, 10 of them agreed to meet with me personally. So I got in my car and in one 3-day period, drove the entirety of the state, or at least the wheat growing portions of the state, and had a meal, shared a meal with these farmers, and sort of asked my very, what I thought was well thought out list of questions about their farming practices, their rotational practices, what was their annual rainfall, what was their average yield, what was their average protein content on wheat, on hard red winter wheat, and then brought all of that back and then tried to make sense of it in a way that I could make some selections on farmers, and also hoping that they would pick me too. I was hoping out of 10 that maybe 1 would say yes, because I was proposing some pretty absurd things to them. One, I was proposing to pay about twice the going rate for organic hard red winter wheat, and I was willing to donate the seed stock so that they would not be purchasing seed stock, so we would have shared exposure and shared risk if those crops should fail, and vastly simplifying the contract process between, which is a traditional relationship between the mill and the farmer, taking a lot of the what has become, in my opinion, predatory and unnecessarily stringent requirements on the farmer out of the contracts. And I was fortunate that all 10 decided that they wanted to grow with me. So then I had I guess, either however you want to look at it, the luxury or the laborious task, unenviable task of deciding who to go with. And I picked 2 farmers. A third that I didn't pick asked if I would provide seed stock. He would just like to try it. And as you might imagine, he did wonderfully. In fact, he did better than the other 2 farmers, and then came to me on harvest day and said, I have all this wheat for you that you didn't ask me to grow, but which I was then very happy to buy. So from the beginning, I've worked with organic farmers. The mill itself is yet to be certified. We outgrew our first facility in just over a year, and it took us the better part of 2 years to complete the facility that we are now in, which is about 3.5 times the size of the original mill. And now that we're hopefully settled for a while, then it's one of our goals for the mill itself to be certified, because we have the capability of cleaning and storing seed for farmers, and also the minute it crosses our doorstep, it loses that certification simply by the fact that we are not certified. So we want to be able to offer cleaning and storage facilities to farmers that want to grow these grains, whether it be a single acre or hundreds of acres. The other thing I'm quite proud about that we're doing is we're trying to incentivize rotation cropping. So when applicable and when we're able, we're encouraging farmers to add additional rotations into their to their plan that are foodstuff crops that have another particular, besides the virtue of being edible, have some other characteristic that is beneficial to their rotation. So we have sold peanuts, we have sold cowpeas, we have sold buckwheat, all of which are valuable additions to a rotation. Most of these farmers are growing cotton primarily, and growing other things in rotation as part of their organic system. If you've been in Texas for any period of time, you know that cotton is king. And so when you go to West Texas, you see pump jacks for oil and you see cotton fields. They'll also grow corn. But my concern is always that cotton and corn strip so much from the soil that we need to have something else in the rotation other than wheat. So many of them have had great success with growing peanuts, but we're also trying legumes. I'm still hoping that in the next year we will be doing bush beans in broad acre application, meaning multiple tons of harvest that'll be harvestable by combine. And then my mission is we sell those at the same cost that the farmer requests from us for those, meaning we keep the cost as low as possible, making those foodstuffs accessible to restaurants and to consumers at a very low rate so that they are also incentivized to buy a lot of it so that we can continue to do these rotations. So that's sort of a little bit about our vision and our mission. We are now up to 10 employees. An average week for us is milling about somewhere between 10 and 15,000 pounds of wheat, corn, and rye. We are now available online for purchase. We sell quite a bit wholesale. Certainly we did pre-COVID, and now things are bouncing back. We were just picked up by Whole Foods Southwest region. So we're in 38 stores in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. We are in Central Market in Texas. So things are finally coming along where we're hitting our stride. And so far things are pointing towards a very sustainable model that should last for years to come. I wanted to leave ample time to ask questions because I know you probably have questions about, in particular, the horticultural practices or agricultural practices of our farmers. And I wanted to make sure that we had time for that. So I'm going to open the floor to questions if I may. Yes, ma'am. Mary.
Where do I begin? I have to say, I buy y'all's grain all the time. I love it so much. I'm a big grit eater. I nix all my grits, so I don't know if you know what that is or.
Yes.
Oh, okay, I nix all my grits. So I actually grew grain this year for the first time. I grew rye in the winter, and I grew millet and sorghum and amaranth. And everything else didn't do well except those.
Wow.
And I was like, who knew? Holy crap, I can go grain.
Yeah, the big issue is not the growing of the grain, it's the harvesting and then the processing that is difficult and laborious. That's a thing that we're actually trying to work on. I have lots of farmers who would like to have grain as a rotation. I mean, it's an excellent winter crop. It's great for weed suppression. It's great for erosion control. But the issue is, how do we get it out when it's time to harvest it? And one of the issues is
so well, but I don't think I harvested. I knew it was ripe, but I thought, oh, I'll wait another week, and it rained, and then it all turned brown. And I went, oh.
That'll happen, and then you have also with most grains the issue of what's called shatter. So at some point the plant knows that the grain is mature, and then the plant's going to release that grain, and you have to beat that to the punch, or you're going to end up with all your crop on the ground.
So that would be really my questions is, okay, so you have to really clear it pretty hard to plant it, because you got to really make contact with the soil. If you put it on top of mulch or other stuff, it just doesn't sprout. So that I figured out. And then once, so I've been kind of mowing and raking, but I'd like to figure out what the step is to let stuff fall down and decompose. Do you have to do an off season to do that, or can you kind of keep going? You know what I mean?
We have some farmers. I mean, I'm working with my farmers to adopt this methodology of no-till seed drill, but I don't have. None of my farmers are currently doing that. But I am acquainted with some farmers who are doing that, and I've actually seen some side-by-side studies where they mow very closely and then do what's called crimping, which is rolling weighted rollers over it to cause it to bend over. And then they plant directly into that stubble. By doing
so
that,
they leave the stubble. Okay.
Yeah, they're retaining organic material, and they're also taking advantage of that erosion control. In that side-by-side study, there was no difference in the performance of the crop that followed it between that was closely mowed and the stuff that was simply crimped over. Now they're using what's called a no-till seed drill, which is an air drill, to put that into the ground. So they're making good soil contact, but the presence of the organic material on the surface of the ground is not a hindrance.
It's not. Okay, so I can just sort of plant around that and not worry about it?
Absolutely.
And then you rotate, like last year I did rye. This year I've been planting inkhorn.
Oh, einkorn, yeah, sure.
Yes. And so I just keep kind of changing it every year. Is that the deal?
That's a great idea. That will keep, especially with disease pressures. We see more and more issues with rust and other disease pressures when you plant the same variety every year, year after year. So that's certainly a great strategy. Einkorn is one of those three ancient grains: Immer, Einkorn, and Spelt. Einkorn meaning German for first kernel. We believe it is the first wheat to appear on the planet. Those three grains have a very challenging processing step to them, which is they are not free threshing. So regular wheat, when it goes into the combine and goes through the threshing machine, all of the heads shatter and the wheat is separated from the hulls. They just fall away naturally. On emmer, einkorn, and spelt, they are physically adhered, like oats, for example. So they have it has an additional processing step where the hulls have to actually be rubbed away from the kernels.
How do you do
And
that?
that's we found a Japanese rice hulling machine that we were able to repurpose for this task. There are German-built, purpose-built machines because the Germans eat lots of ancient grains. But to give you some idea, the baby intro model is about $60,000. So we opted to adapt something that was more readily available. But that means in the growing of those that you have to come up with a process for, if you want to eat it, for getting those hulls off. Oh, wow.
That's my millet.
That looks beautiful.
Isn't it?
It is the cutest and most petable of the
I'm
grains.
so proud.
Let's see. I did say, let's see. I did promise that I would say something a little bit about these guys behind me. You know, I'm not really in the middle room. This is my virtual background. These are Asti rollers. They're made in Austria, just on the Austrian-Italian border. They're made of clear pine. I selected these because the two mills that I went and visited at least started their businesses with these, and I got some familiarity with them. We now have an American company called New American Stone Mills that's making similar mills, but they have they have powder coated steel enclosures, which as a former artist, as a musician, just isn't nearly as sexy to me as these wooden things that look like Danish furniture to me. And we have observation windows in the mill room so that visitors can come and watch the millers working. And they're just pieces of art, in my opinion. You can see the hoppers on top, these sort of inverted pyramids, and we can control the flow of that grain down through those into the enclosure. See if I can do this. There we go. Into the enclosure right here, this drum section. And that's enclosing the top stone, the runner stone. That's the one that moves and rotates in a circle. Below that, down right there, you can see just that stone that's protruding below the enclosure. That's the bed stone. That one's stationary. And so we can control the distance of the stones apart, the rate at which we feed the grain into the mill, and the rotational speed. And all of those have a profound effect on what comes out of the mill. For example, for your grits, we run the mill at a very high speed, and we run a lot of grain through at quite an accelerated rate for very upside down reasons, which is originally people wanted to make corn flour, and grits were a byproduct that ingenious Southerners learned how to eat. But that was something that was considered waste. So in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, corn flour was the desirable good, and the grits were a byproduct. Well, now in the 21st century, everyone wants grits, and almost no one wants cornmeal. So we're trying to intentionally be inefficient with our milling and make as much byproduct as we can and as little product as possible. It's an upside down and backwards proposition, but we've sort of gotten fairly good at it. Let's see. I want to go through some of these questions here, and then I'll call for additional questions. Growing corn, yeah. Challenges growing corn. There are a lot of challenges growing corn, and I didn't get into this business to grow corn. I really wanted to do wheat and rye and other grains for bread, but I got quickly enamored with corn. The sheer amount of genetic diversity, the colors and varieties and shapes and sizes, and also the culinary applications, everything from cornmeal to fine corn flour, say 2 to 3%, and a true French traditional baguette has a tiny bit of corn flour in it. Grits and polenta, not to mention beer and distillate, which we sell a lot of grain for those. Right now we have a relationship with Treaty Oak Distillery. We provide them with about 1.7 million pounds of grain a year for making their Ghost Hill line of products, which is whiskey and rye. So it is certainly great for that. There are a lot of challenges to milling it, but from the agricultural side, one of the things that's the most challenging for us is that we are trying to keep these open pollinated varieties identity preserved. We don't want any cross-pollination, and we don't want to degrade the purity of the organic of the varieties that we have. So for a farmer to grow corn, for me, one of the heirloom varieties that we produce, they have to guarantee me that there is not any corn being grown within 1 square mile of where this corn's being grown. So we stick a pin in the map and draw a circle, and there can't be anything within a mile. Not to mention the fact that we have all of these issues now with if genetic material from an owned intellectual property corn turns up in the heirloom corn, then these producers, Syngenta, Monsanto, can show up and claim ownership of all of that corn. So that's very dangerous as well. So we're having to watch out for that. Corn is, at least where we've been growing, it's been highly susceptible to armyworms, and then also to aflatoxin, which is a spore-borne fumonisin and aflatoxin, which are spore-borne diseases that usually manifest themselves after the corn's been put in stress, whether that be drought stress or insect stress. And so what's happened to us a fair number of times is that the armyworms come in, put the corn under stress, and then we get a reasonable or more than a reasonable amount of precipitation close to harvest. And that's when these spores take hold. And so for those of you that don't know, there are federally stated limits for those, because they do really bad things to human beings, like liver disease and cancer and birth defects. So we have to be extremely careful about those, and everything has to be tested. But once those corn varieties are put into stress, particularly some of these older varieties, they are highly susceptible to aflatoxin. So it is a big risk, and it is a big challenge. I think we're getting better at it, smarter about planting and timing of planting. I think we may see a point soon where we can plant closer to 1 square mile where there's good cooperation with other farmers. Crop timing will work. Most of these are really long to maturity, over 105 days, maybe 100 up to 120 days. And if we can time those crops with other farmers that are growing corn, we can miss cross-pollination. So those are some of the challenges that we deal with every year, but I wouldn't give up on it for the world. I love the genetic diversity we currently have: red, white, blue, yellow, and green corn. And for those who like to Google things, there's a wonderful variety out there called Carl's Glass Gem that we're going to be bringing into development. That's a popping corn, but it looks like jewelry. It has every color of the rainbow on the cob. And from the moment I saw it, I was taken with it and knew that we had to grow that. So we've grown out our seed stocks, and hopefully we'll be doing that here pretty soon. Can oats be grown in Texas? Yes, they can. We had a trial crop this last year with an old variety that one of our farmers in New Braunfels has grown for generations. It grows extremely well, but it's more of a forage oat. So this year we're trying our hand with something that would have more of a culinary application, but it is definitely doable in the state of Texas. Another thing we like about oats is when we're doing soil remediation, oats are one of the great things to plant to sort of help get soil back into balance. Some of these farmers have old pieces of property that grew cotton for years and years and years and years, and those farmers put the same fertilizer with those same 3 numbers on it every single year, whether it needed it or not. Not to mention some other contaminations. Oats seem to do a really fantastic job of helping to sort of remediate those poor soils. I love the wheat flour, polenta, and cornmeal. Thank you very much. We're working hard at that, and we appreciate your support. Let's see. I really can't seem to grow it. Is that the blue fungus? Let's see. So I think you're talking about huitlacoche, which is, I think, still technically illegal to grow in the United States. That doesn't mean that people don't do it. Occasionally it'll pop up on menus. It is something that is a canned food item that you can be imported from Mexico, but fresh huitlacoche, I think, is still prohibited in the United States, which is unfortunate because it is fantastic. But I understand the concerns about things like that getting out of hand. We have to be responsible. Let's see. Weevils in stored grain. Do we have problems with that? You betcha we do. So we get lots of questions about what are the differences between conventionally raised grain that becomes flour and organic. And the differences are manifold. But I think two of the big things are insecticides in the field, but then also storicides as that grain is coming into the elevator. They use, in conventional agriculture, they use something called storicides, which they physically spray, essentially insecticide on the grain as it's coming into the elevator in order to hedge against insect pressures. And that would be weevils, granary beetles, and India moths or pantry moths, which are darn pernicious. Once you get them in your pantry, they're tough to get rid of. When I was trying to figure out how we were going to deal with that in the Northwest, they've had for generations a way of dealing with that, which is in the wintertime, they pull cold air through the grain elevator until they lower the core temperature of that thermal mass of grain down to below freezing. And once you've moved that core temperature down that far, in those kinds of volumes, you can keep it that cold until May or June, until the next harvest. And so the problems that they had with insect pressures were relatively few. Here in Central Texas, we don't get enough cold weather to do that, and we don't stay cold long enough. So we had to find another way to do that. And so I found, after much searching, a company in the Netherlands that makes a machine that can do modified atmospheric packaging on a 1-ton level. So we take a tote, which is about a 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot cube full of grain, usually weighs between 2,000 and 2,500 pounds. And we put a vacuum bag around that and heat seal it shut. And then we pull a vacuum on that, remove all the oxygen, and then we pump it full of CO2. And that works extremely well for us. The research suggests 100% insect mortality at all life stages within 10 days. And so far, that's proved to be true for us. We've had really good success with that. We even have one farmer now who's doing that in big silos. He's actually generating his own nitrogen and pumping his silos full of nitrogen. Again, great natural ways of dealing with insect pressures without using chemicals. Another option is diatomaceous earth, but I'm not wild about eating diatomaceous earth, so we don't employ that particular methodology. For those who are storing grain at home for milling later, and we have more and more people doing that now, I recommend freezing. Freezing works extremely well. You don't have to worry about the freshness of the grain itself. It's perfectly shelf stable at room temperature, but it will certainly help with corn and wheat and rye if you keep it frozen. It's a great and easy way to deal with that problem. Let's see. Does Whole Foods sell your flour refrigerated? No, they don't. It's at room temperature. And if you're not concerned with flour going rancid, yeah, I'm absolutely concerned. But we're finding 3 to 4 months shelf life is totally doable if it's in an air-conditioned space. We've had very little. In fact, to my knowledge, no returns for rancid flour. To be perfectly honest, we have occasionally had people make claims that they've had weevils or some insect pressures. I said these things work great, but they're not 100% perfect, and we can't always account for maybe folks having stuff in their pantry that just migrated. But we replace that stuff nonetheless. But as far as rancidity goes, we haven't really had problems. It seems to be too that people are using the flour before 4 months, so that hasn't been a problem. Let's see. Also, the Osceola mills. Do you know of where to get extra screens for sifting? Gosh, let's see. Well, we have. Let's see if I can point to it again. That machine in the very back there is my disappearing finger. That's kind of cool. The sort of ugly beige machine in the back is an eccentric sifter, and it has screens in it that sift flour for us, and we make various sifted flours. You can buy screens if you want to do your own sifting at home. You can buy screens on Amazon, anywhere from a 50 mesh screen to a 100 mesh screen, and those numbers apply to the number of holes per linear inch. So a 100 screen, which is what we use to make 00 flour or pizza and pasta flour, has 100 holes per linear inch. I wouldn't recommend trying to do that by hand at home unless you have forearms of steel, because that's a lot of sifting. But 50 and even maybe 60 is totally doable, and you'll make something akin to 85% extraction flour or type 85 flour, which has a lot of applications. Have we ever had problems with ergot in Texas? Not so far. Ergot is, for those who are not familiar, is a disease pressure, again, spore-borne, that happens in high moisture areas. Tends to happen more in the Northeast. It's a pretty nasty thing, akin to vomitoxin. It is a hallucinogenic. So there are some theories that the Salem witch trials all had to do with infected rye that was infected with ergot that caused people to hallucinate, which is an interesting side note, but nothing that you want to consume. We're fortunate for the most part that where most of our grain is growing is fairly dry and arid. We can get rain sometimes close to harvest, which is always a danger, but so far, no ergot. I don't know. Angel, can they mail a check to the treasurer for membership?
Larry, I'm not familiar. Larry, where can checks be sent? Can you put that?
We'll talk to her on offline. Thanks.
Sure. Let's see. What do you recommend for processing grain at home? Oats and einkorn. That's a good question. Oh my gosh, there's a raccoon going right by my window. Sorry, I'm apparently ADD. Gosh, for processing grain at home, if you want to grow it and then from that stage and then harvest it, I think your best bets are going to be you're going to need to thresh the grain first. And there's some easy methods for doing that. A lot of people will find a small barrel with a screw top lid, or some easy to seal lid, maybe even like a 5-gallon bucket, and put some links of chain and some other heavy items in there, and then agitate that, roll it around, shake it, and you'll do all the threshing that's necessary to separate the grain from the chaff. Then you need to wind or winnow that. And if you've ever seen indigenous peoples do that, they do it in a large tray and they throw it up in the air on a windy day and the chaff will blow off. There's an easier way to do that, or a more predictable way to do that now, which is to stand on a ladder and pour it from one vessel into another with a box fan blowing on it. And you can very efficiently blow the chaff off. Einkorn is gonna be rough. I have seen online, if you look on YouTube, there have been a couple people who've made rice and einkorn hullers at home. And essentially what you're doing is making two rubber-faced discs that you can adjust the distance apart of these two discs, and then you're going to introduce the grain into that, and it's that rubbing that will rub the hull off. If you're mechanically inclined and an ingenious individual, you can certainly come up with a way of doing that, and it is definitely Googleable, we'll say. Let's see. Can you tell us about the garbanzo beans? Yes. It's an interesting question. We're living in an interesting time, obviously, with all of the things that have transpired this year. And during some of the protests that have happened in the past months, I've had individuals reach out to me and say, what are you doing for farmers of color? What are you doing for indigenous farmers? What are you doing to help bootstrap and support those individuals? And I have to say I was surprised. I now know of one farmer of color in Travis County, period, who's in East Austin, and we have a relationship with her and are looking at increasing ways to help her in her endeavors in gardening and growing crops that are sustainable in East Austin. But it was food for thought. And so I sat down with my staff and we just started brainstorming about what ways might we be able to, given the fact that we're a relatively new company and not necessarily a company of great means, but a company that wants to engage on that level and to be supportive on that level, what might we be able to do? So we were able to reach out to Ramona Farms, which is a indigenous run farm in New Mexico, and to buy grain from them and start a program with them of buying grain in bulk from them, with the understanding that we're going to turn around and resell it, given that they sell also online. But we wanted to make it available here in Texas. It's baby steps. We bought a ton of garbanzo beans, and we bought a ton of hard winter wheat as a starting point, with the thought that we'll continue to grow that program and do our part to help increase the number of indigenous farmers that are in the state. I've had great honor of listening to and communicating with Glenn Roberts of Anson Mills in South Carolina. And he says it rightly, which is that women and people and persons of color were responsible far more than old white men for the success of agriculture in the history of this nation, and that they need to be supported and recognized for that role. And I heartily agree. And it's overdue, and we're gonna make up for lost time. But thanks for asking that question. They also are darn delicious, and we're hoping soon that we'll be able to make garbanzo flour out of some of those garbanzo beans for several ethnic dishes that some of our chefs are asking for. Let's see. Have you heard any anecdotes from people with celiac that are able to eat ancient wheats that aren't desiccated with glyphosate? I'm really hesitant to ever recommend to anyone that has celiac disease that they eat anything containing gluten, because that's a food allergy. We have tons of people who have a wheat intolerance or a grain intolerance who can tolerate our grain with no side effects. But if you have true celiacs, I don't recommend eating those at all, because you do lasting and permanent damage to your digestive tract. So I'd never suggest that. But if you have a wheat intolerance, a lot of that is caused by, it's essentially a three-pronged stool. You have a lot of chemicals that are being added to the soil prior to planting. Sometimes that's to desiccate the crop prior. We see that a lot. Then you have fertilizers and soil amendments that are not organic. Then you have some people who are accelerating the browning down of wheat in order to get wheat in before weather patterns change to wet weather patterns. Then we have the store sides that we talked about in the storage phase. And then you have in the milling, the adding of all sorts of dough enhancers, baking performance enhancers. We also now, since World War I, we fortify wheat because we've stripped all the nutrient value out of it, and that comes back in the form of chemical additives for the vitamin content that's required now by government mandate for roller milled flour. And then you have bakeries that are large scale commercial bakeries that are adding additional chemicals in the form of preservatives and baking enhancers on the back end. So you see all of these opportunities where chemicals are being added to the process. It's little wonder that people have problems tolerating it. And all of the evidence that I've seen bears out that it's not the wheat, it's all the other junk that's in there. Let's see. There needs to be a community mill like the old days. I couldn't agree more. I think that's a great idea. I think one of the things that we hope to do is to be able to toll mill, meaning if you grew some wheat and you bring it in, we would be able to mill it for you either for a portion of the grain that you grew or for a fee. And we certainly take our namesake, Barton Springs Mill, from William Barton's mill, that was not on what's now the location of Barton Springs, and was later run by the Podgies. If you're familiar with Podgie House, Podgie was the miller that was running that operation, and that entire operation pretty much existed by community milling, by toll milling, milling the grains and products that mostly in those days corn that farmers brought in exchange for a cut of the crop. So I think that's great, and I certainly want to see us do that. For those of you who are fans of modern agriculture and food safety, we have a new legislation called the Food Safety Modernization Act, which exacts some pretty stringent food safety requirements on us that will make it more difficult for us to do those sorts of things because we're not controlling the food from the ground all the way to the consumer. But I'm determined to figure out ways that we can do that satisfy the requirements. But it will be an additional challenge that we have to meet. Let's see. Can you tell us about the Bakers Against Racism? Absolutely, yeah. Boy, that turned out to be a fantastic activity and exercise that shows what our community is capable of when they're motivated. This was part of also those challenges. What are we going to do to support those who need our support? And so I said, let's allocate 1 ton, 2,000 pounds of flour, and let's make it available first to all of our wholesale clients who would like to do bake sales. And then if there's any left, to any of our small community cottage bakers within the state of Texas that want to do bake sales in order to raise money to support activities against racism. And I didn't feel confident in naming a particular entity to do that. So what I said was each individual baker simply makes a request for flour, conducts the bake sale, then turns all the proceeds over to a cause of their choosing. And then we just simply wanted to make a tally to see how far the wheat went in supporting these endeavors. And I think the last count, because we had some stragglers, was that we generated about $38,000 from 2,000 pounds of wheat, which is pretty extraordinary. I'm humbled by those outcomes. It's really something to see, and I think it's something that we will continue to do, perhaps on a yearly basis. I'd love to take the credit for that, but there was a wonderful group of mills and bakers on the East Coast that did something similar, and we wanted to do one that was within our region, working with our folks, which is really largely within the state of Texas. So thanks for that question. let's see, do you get any grain from Mexico? I saw the most beautiful rainbow of colors down there. We don't currently. That's not to say that it won't happen. We're now, as I said, very big into corn. We have people all the time wanting us to start nixtamalizing corn. That is a food safety nightmare for us in our facility because we're adding moisture to the process. Right now, we are a 100% dry process, and that makes us liable, or we have to adhere to a certain set of rules. The minute you add moisture to a dry process facility, it's almost like you're slaughtering chickens, the requirements for that. So the requirements for us in terms of food safety, accountability, record keeping, third-party audits, all of that stuff go up logarithmically. And I'm not convinced yet that we would do enough business with nixtamalizing that it would be sustainable. But it's on my list, and we're going to teach nixtamalizing in classes in the education center that we have at the mill starting this next year. So we'll equip people with the cow and the corn, and we now have a masa grinding mill in the education center. And we sell a lot of corn to wholesale clients here, and particularly in Austin. Suerte is one of our clients. And so we will probably have Fermin Nunez come in and teach one of those classes on nixtamalization. I kind of would prefer people do it themselves. I really like it when people know exactly where their food comes from. And to that end, we have a small mill in the education center as well. I enjoy selling whole grain to people and for them to mill it themselves. I think those are great endeavors that everybody should at least try. As far as coming from Mexico, yeah, I just, I'm always concerned because at this point in time, other countries are not held to the same standard as domestic farmers in terms of their organic certification and the checks and balances and criteria and inspections that take place. And so for many of my clients, the organic grain is of paramount importance. And until I think I get to the size that I can go and conduct audits for myself and ensure that what we're getting is truly organic, I'm going to hold off on that. But there's a great supplier here in the United States, Macienda, that's providing heirloom corns that are supposed to be both conventional and organically grown. I think it's doable, and it's certainly on the radar. First, I love your products and especially appreciate your providing grains in the early pandemic days when stores were sold out of flour. Well, thank you. That was a hard time. Second, we hear from a number of people looking for a clean source of straw. Do any of your growers provide that in Austin? I think we're in a situation where we could do that this coming year. One of the great things about these old varieties is that they're tall, what we call tall straw varieties. A couple of the rye varieties are shoulder high. Some of the wheats are at least chest high. And if you catch us at the right time, which would be in the month of June, we could probably make that readily available. And maybe I need to make some sort of move to try to organize a way for people to communicate with me and for us to coordinate the opportunity to go out and get that, but I bet it could be done. I now have a farmer in Rockdale and one in New Braunfels. Those would be close enough to go and to take advantage of those straw opportunities. Before the pandemic, we were also taking outings with folks out to see these crops in the field, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that again soon. As far as what went on during the pandemic, just to give you some idea of what that was like. In 2019, between mid-November and the end of December, so from ramp up to Thanksgiving through Christmas, we had our biggest online retail week ever, which was, I think, 40 online orders in a week. We started out wholesale. and moved into retail relatively recently. But that's just to give you a benchmark. During the height of March and April, we saw 300 online orders a day, and it was difficult to accommodate that, to say the very least. Now, our wholesale business dropped off to zero, and thanks to you and those who ordered from us online, it really sustained us during that time, but it made it a difficult time. I told you that an average week for us is 10 to 15 thousand pounds a week. We're milling over 10 to 15,000 pounds a week. We're milling over 35,000 pounds a week and running the mill 24 hours a day. But one of the great, I think, humbling and satisfying things was that I was able to hire many of my wholesale clients who were out of work to come in and bag and box and label during that time when they needed work. And it's one of the great things about these community sustained endeavors, and the fact that we have that kind of closeness and immediacy, that we're able to help each other when we need that kind of help. Some of those people came to parties at my house and hand sorted corn, color sorted corn, one kernel at a time before the mill was open. Having that ability to work together and to support each other and hold each other up was a humbling and satisfying experience, if not exhausting. Let's see. The green corn. The green corn currently comes from just outside of Amarillo. Originally, it is Oaxacan green corn that comes. There's some debate about this. There are some that say Oaxacan green corn never came from Oaxaca. That was a convenient name that somebody named it, and it doesn't come from there. I don't have ironclad evidence to support either way, that it either comes from Oaxaca or doesn't. It does currently grow in Oaxaca now, but ours is grown by a small cooperative of farmers between Amarillo and the New Mexico border, and it's delicious. If you can get past the color, I think it's absolutely fantastic. Red also regrettably does not retain its red color, turns sort of a chocolate brown color, but both are amazing. You know, we talked about the genetic diversity of these corn varieties. In addition to color, the flavor and aroma profiles are so different. It's just a great thing to hold up and celebrate. Let's see. I think I've covered all the questions. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask? I'm happy to.
Can you identify this for me? It came up randomly.
Wow. Is that sorghum?
That's what I thought. Maybe sorghum.
Yeah, maybe that's sorghum. Yeah.
Stop.
I'm not 100% certain, but it looks like sorghum that I've seen, and we occasionally get requests to grow that, and that's another thing that's so fun and frustrating about working with chefs. They're like, I want sorghum, I want millet, I want sesame seeds. I'm like, well, how many do you want? Oh, probably 2 pounds a week. I'm like, well, I need you to take 5 tons over the next year for me to be able to put that into production. And so we have to constantly sort of ask our wholesale clients, and we reach out to online to our retail clients about what they're interested in having. If you know about Anson Mills, for example, their product catalog is immense. I don't honestly know how Glenn Roberts is able to keep so many different food items in stock and in production. He may be spot buying, whereas my model is that I'm contracting with all the farmers to grow a specific amount, and then I take it on the day of harvest, and I'm stuck with it. To give you some idea, this year in June, we took in 300 tons of wheat and rye. So that's a lot to take in, and it's a lot to pay for in 1 month. But we are constantly looking at other food items. We're certainly going to get into beans, mostly because I want to see my farmers growing them in rotation. And there's, again, so much genetic diversity there in beans that I'm hoping we can find some good bush varieties that I've got plenty of wholesale clients that will take those by the 50-pound bag. So that's more doable for us. Amaranth, I get the occasional request for amaranth. Not enough yet to make me be bold and go out and plant 20 acres. And another thing with a lot of these other varieties of grain is that they have different harvesting methodologies. So you have to keep that in mind. So does it require additional equipment or different techniques for harvesting? Sometimes things like buckwheat, for example, need to go from the combine to the seed cleaner immediately, or they will go bad because of the amount of organic material that inadvertently gets harvested with it. It's a very inefficient harvesting methodology. So you have to look at all those things and see if, well, am I going to ask the farmer to buy a $10,000 or $20,000 or $30,000 attachment for his combine to grow 10 acres of something? We look at all of that. And I'm hoping that some of these alternative grains will gain some more traction. I think the other possibility is that we, like we have done in the past, we spot buy some of those from people who are already producing them and then try to build those markets. I think given the opportunity to do that, we can do that, and I'm certainly in favor of that. Any other questions?
I have a question. My dad had a grist mill in our barn that he ran off of using the power takeoff from his tractor.
Sure.
For probably about 60 years. But it was, your stones lay flat and his stones were up and down. Does that make sense? And so
yes,
he fed the, I mean, I don't really know how the insides worked, but he fed the corn from a hopper, like your hoppers, but they looked like, I mean, I just assumed that corn was falling right down in between the stones. Is that what was happening? And how is that different than how your hoppers, like for your hoppers, how does the core or whatever you're grinding, how does it get in between the stones? Like, is there a hole there and it gets pushed out by centrifugal force, or what happens there?
So yeah, your dad more than likely had a Meadows mill. Those are made in North Carolina. That company's been around for a very long time. And they're using what's called a vertical mill. And the grain is being, the stones are dressed, or the pattern that's cut in them is cut in a different way, but the grain is being, I still think, is being introduced through the eye of one stone, meaning the hole in the center. Those mills are known for having much higher capacity, especially when you're milling corn. They're the obvious choice because the capacity is higher. You can, the through flow rate on that is much higher. For wheat, I don't like the flour that they make because it tends to be a little bit coarser. But for wheat products, those are fantastic. On ours here, let's see if I can do this. So there we go. You can see a little plate there below the hopper, just a little protrusion. That's called the shoe, and it goes up against the bottom of that hopper, and you're able to open it. It's got a leather strap on one side, and then it's controlled by this geared cog here with some strings that go down. It's very low tech, but you're able to open and close that hopper and control the rate of feed through this shoe. From the bottom of that shoe is a single dowel pin that extends down into the mill, and the top of the shaft that's rotating that upper stone has an eccentric hub on it that knocks that dowel pin, and it just doses the grain out into the mill, and it's falling down through the hole, the eye of the stone, through the center of the stone. And as the millstones turn, there's a pattern cut in that that goes from very wide, very deep furrows out to nothing. And they're cut in right angles that oppose each other. So you have one right angle on the bottom this way, and the other cross section, the right angle is above. So you have a shearing action, almost like taking scissors and clipping the grain. And as it works its way out towards the end, those furrows go to nothing. So you go from clipping to grinding to fine grinding as the grain travels down that path. And that's been the methodology since the Roman times.
And I think you said you control the size of what you get out by the speed.
So you have three variables. You have the rate at which you put grain into the mill, the distance of the stones apart, which we can control, and then the rotational speed. They did have that capability on grist mills that were wind and water driven by means of gearing. We do it with variable frequency drives. We cheat, we make it easy. We do it with the speed control. But all of those have a profound effect on the outcome. However, the single most important variable is the rate of speed at which you feed the grain into the mill. If you don't get that right, you build up heat in the mill. You start having problems with the performance of the mill, and you have to shut down due to overheating. And you also can't make fine flour because you're pushing flour. You have grain coming behind the other grain, pushing it out at a faster rate. And so getting that rate of feed right is key. And I didn't learn that overnight. There are no schools of operative milling for stone milling. Kansas City State is the only, I believe, institution in the United States that teaches milling, and that's roller milling only. So you just go in there and put some wheat in there and wreck some wheat until you figure it out.
I think for Dad's mill, I don't think he varied the speed. I think the only thing he varied was the distance between the stones, because the grain, I mean, this was the most fabulous thing to see as a kid. The corn, we fed it in as cobs, and it had I don't know what you call it, it had some kind of this thing that rotated, and it had these claws on it that just knocked the kernels off of the cob. I mean, it was just the most absolutely fabulous thing to see as a kid, that we put these cob down there and knocked all the grain off. So there wasn't much speed as far as doing it. Everything went in fairly slowly, one cob at a time. But as kids, we loved to do it, and the smell of grinding corn was just fabulously fabulous.
It's intoxicating. It's a thing that I think people are missing, and especially when they're buying cornmeal and corn products that are probably over a year old by the time they get to the shelf and get to someone's home. You're missing the joy of freshly milled products. We have one of those John Deere corn hullers in our education center, and people love to feed corn into that thing, but it is positively a violent activity. Yes. The way it strips those kernels off of the cob.
Yeah.
Any other questions that I can answer? I'm happy to answer.
Looks like there's one about malting.
Malting, let's see. I've heard a rumor you will be doing some malting. Yes, I believe that is going to happen. When we built the new facility, I did build a malting floor with the intention of starting to do some floor malting. That is the traditional methodology for creating malted grains. In the places where there's the birth and cultivation of malting, particularly in the British Isles, their floors are heated in order to control the temperature in the cold, wet months. Here in Texas, we have to chill the floor to keep it cool enough. So we put glycol tubing in the floor so that we're able to chill the floor. And because as the grains sprout, they generate heat. And so we don't get enough ambient cold. So we'll have to, from the environment, we'll have to air condition the room and chill the floor, and we'll do what's called couching the grain. So it goes into a tank, it's soaked, and the water's replaced daily until we start to see sprouting. Then it's removed from the tank and placed on the floor and raked and turned 4 times a day minimum to make sure that we dissipate and the heat and moisture, and that we distribute the moisture well until the rootlet is about half the length of the grain itself, at which point we want to arrest that growing process. So what we've done is we've set in motion enzymatic action of the alpha beta amylase enzymes within those grains that are converting those starches into sugars that the young plant can eat until it can take in nourishment from the soil. Those are the same things we want to jumpstart fermentation and liquor making, and also to enhance browning and the baking of bread. So once we get that just to the sweet spot, we have to arrest that, and we do that by placing it in a kiln. And you can simply dry it to arrest the continued growth and enzymatic activity, or you can continue to heat it and toast it to various levels of color that are desirable in beer making in particular. So it was the only thing that was going to be missing. You may know that we're going to be the landlord to Abby Jane Bakery that'll open within the next week or so. On this one campus between myself and Treaty Oak, you'll see beer production, distillate production, baking. We have a wood-fired oven, and then we'll be doing pizza. And we're milling the grain. The only thing we have test plots, so we'll be growing grain on campus. The only thing we were going to be missing was malting. So I decided we would jump into that too. Now, it cost me way more than I thought to get this building built and up and running during COVID. So it may be another year before we're able to get the malting floor up and running, but that is something that's going to happen.
I had a question about moths. So really is the only way to stop them is to refrigerate your grain?
Let's see. It's refrigerate or really freeze the grain. I think larva stage there is the most nasty to control. And the best way to do that is to freeze those. I know that people who have problems with those kind of moths, and once they get into your pantry, tea tree oil is a good methodology for that. They really hate the smell of that, and it will drive them away. You could apply heat, but then you would probably be destroying the baking properties of the grain if you did that. Above 150 degrees Fahrenheit, you have not only alpha and beta amylase enzyme breakdown, but you have protein breakdown. And I think you'd have to get up that high to kill those little critters. The way they do it in modern mills is something called an intillator, which is once they've made the flour, and once they've taken their samples of the flour to establish the number of bug parts per million as allowed by the FDA, they take the flour and they accelerate it. It almost looks like a particle accelerator. It goes down a tube at a very high rate of speed and hits a hardened steel surface. And anything that's left in there that is a living organism is obliterated into a million pieces. That's why they count the bug parts per million before they do that activity. But that's a way that they help to hedge against having insect pressures in commercially made flour. That methodology, because of the way that they move product through a line and the distance that they move it, there are economical ways for them to do that that are not available to us to do on our scale. But we do our best work to get rid of them with the modified atmospheric packaging. And so I've had precious few issues, thankfully, knock on wood.
So,
I have one question about mesquite. So
Sure.
I've been making my own mesquite flour for several years. And I know you all were doing some mesquite processing with Sandeep a while back. Is that something that you all will continue to do?
I'm on the fence about it. It's difficult. For those that are not aware, mesquite pods are an indigenous foodway. They're really high in natural sugars. So there's a fair amount of nutritive value there, but it's also absolutely amazing to bake with, to cook with. One of my favorite things is mesquite butter, which is superfine mesquite powder mixed into Peule French butter. That is one of the most amazing things. It has a baking spice and molasses flavor profile, but there's also sort of a can't quite put your finger on it thing there that's really intoxicating. A lot of bakers will use it 2 to 3% in baked goods, and it makes a huge impact even on that very small scale. But there are challenges with the sourcing of it. So it has to be foraged. The requirements are that it has to come off the tree. It can't be picked up off the ground. Each tree, like many other kinds of trees, has its own flavor components. And so you have to taste each tree, which involves chewing on a pod to see if you like the flavor that comes from that particular one. Then the pods are harvested. There needs to be a kill step because they are inevitably inhabited by insects on the inside. You'll see little tiny holes on many of the mesquite pods. So we can do that by freezing or by toasting. And what we've done most recently is freeze for 10 days to 2 weeks. And then we are sun roasting. We were sun roasting them. We had half of our facility built, and we had this huge 8,500 square foot slab. And so I was sun roasting them on days that it was 105 degrees outside. That worked great. Then we have to mill it. It has to be hammer milled rather than stone milled. It's very sticky and messy. So we put it through the hammer mill that we use for our corn products for our distilling and brewing partners. And then it has to be sifted through a dedicated sifter because it just gums up the works. We wouldn't be able to recover. So we still have all that equipment. We did receive about 500 pounds of mesquite pods this year that proved to be infested with an inordinate amount of aflatoxin, so it's not edible. So it's a series of like all farming and all agriculture. It is littered with disappointment. But I'm hoping we can get back to it this next year. We still have some in stock. What we don't have right now is the processing machinery set up. You can process it at home, and if you're interested in having some, you can reach out to me and we can probably set you up with some pods. But my hope is we can get back to doing mesquite flour because it is an amazing thing. Grapevine has it that there may be a couple of other businesses coming online that are going to be featuring mesquite flour, including one that may be an indigenous person's run endeavor. And if that's the case, then I think that's all the impetus I need to step out of the marketplace there and allow that to happen. So we'll see. All I can say, I guess, at this point is we'll see.
A couple of questions in the chat.
Let's see. What is your current favorite flour for pizza? Ooh, depends on the pizza. We've been really liking the Yocoro Rojo lately in 00 for making pizza at the mill. Abby Jane has, I built her a 50-inch wood-fired pizza oven, and she's continued to do bake trials while she waits to open. And that's been really outstanding as a all-purpose, all-application pizza flour. We've also been really fortunate to do some events with Chris Bianco. For those who are not familiar, he is the only James Beard Award-winning pizzaiolo to ever be awarded in the United States. And he comes here to do Southern Smoke and to do things at Luck Ranch with Willie Nelson fundraisers. And he makes a sauceless pizza that we make a special blend for him that is Yocoro Rojo and Rouge de Bordeaux. The Rouge de Bordeaux has all of these baking spice and cinnamon uh, flavor notes and aromas. But he's pairing that with house cured sausage that has sort of curing spices in it, caramelized onions, and smoked mozzarella. So in that instance, the rouge is amazing. What it's not good with is anything with garlic or tomatoes in it. So if you're going to do a traditional red sauce pizza, avoid the rouge at all costs. I think the TAM 10500 and the Ruby Lee also work extremely well. The Yokoro has a malty flavor component to it that reminds me of a lot of wheats that have a malt added to them for flavor and also to enhance enzyme activity to enhance browning. And the Yokoro just has that naturally built into it. So that's my current favorite. Let's see. Got 2 pizza ones there. Let's see, what's your favorite? Gluten-free flour for pizza. You know, I'm a gluten-full kind of guy as opposed to a gluten-free guy. I don't have that much. I'm doing all I can to hang on to the gluten side of things. So it's not my area of expertise. I think one of the biggest challenges for gluten-free for me is the amount of processing that has to happen in order to make those items work. And I think one of the most encouraging things I've seen in the gluten-free field recently is that industry sort of coming out the other side of that. Historically, so many gluten-free items had so much processing and so much stuff going on in order to make that work in a way that mimics something with gluten in it, that it was concerning. But thank God for science and technology. I think we're coming out the other side of that. I wish I had a good answer for you, but I don't. Sorry. I think that covers it.
No more burning questions, but man, what a fun lecture. Every grain question answered. I love it.
Well, we hope that once we have either a vaccine or we see significant abatement in COVID cases in both Travis and Hayes County, that we'll be able to open the education center fully. That's a 1,000 square foot facility where we can have resume our baking classes and hopefully classes on pasta and nixtamalization and all things grain, and resume tours, including walking out through the wheat fields behind the mill. I'm hoping that dream will come true here very soon and that you can all join us out there.
Nixtamalization is really an understated thing to do with corn. I don't think enough people know how much more delicious corn can be from that simple thing. It's amazing.
Well, and as I've seen at some of these seminars that I've gone to, nixtamalizing of other small grains is an amazing thing too, to bring out flavor components and to eke even more interesting flavor components out of these grains. So you can nixtamalize other things besides corn, buckwheat, and other grains as well.
I'm kind of limited for the gluten-free thing, so. But I'm going to try einkorn. We'll see what happens.
I think you'll like the einkorn. I think but do exercise caution.
Because?
Do you have a gluten sensitivity or do you have celiacs?
I don't have celiacs.
Okay.
I think I'm just straight up allergic.
So as long as you have celiacs, go for it. And I think you'll find that the ancient grains and many of the landrace grains, which I sort of qualify as before 1930, so Turkey Red, Red Fife, Marquis from our lineup, for example, most people that have issues can tolerate those with absolutely no problem. When I was still working in the fine arts industry, I had an administrative assistant who couldn't tolerate grain at all. It gave her serious gastrointestinal issues. And I said, let me bake you a loaf of bread and take it home and try it. on the weekend when you're home and
That's what I'm
not having to
saying.
be out in public. Yeah.
Feel bad for a while. Yeah.
And so she came back on Monday. And I said, "How did it go?" She goes, "It was fantastic. I ate the entire loaf in one sitting." I said, "That's not what I told you to do." But she had absolutely no problems with that, and she now bakes with our flours and frequents establishments that use our grains and has really no problem. So that goes to show that it's something in the chemical compounds that are being used in all of these other processes leading up to the consuming of these modern grains that's the culprit, not the grain itself.
I got allergic one time from using wheat glue.
Wow. Well, gluten shows up in so many products, cosmetics, for example. I mean, you really have to read the label and read carefully. It's in many, many, many products, and if you have an allergy, you really have to be careful.
It is what it is. You go on with life. So I really want to thank everybody for coming, and James especially. Oh my God, I am so grateful for you to come out and tell us all these grain secrets that I've always been itching to ask. So
I'm seeing now that as the sun went down, because I was facing my window for the good light, it looks more and more now like I'm in a witness protection program. You can't see my face. I apologize for that.
no,
But it was a genuine pleasure to be here, and I hope that each of you can come out to the mill and visit when we're open to the public. I'd love to talk to people.
Organize a tour and we'll all come. How about that?
That would be great.
That would be so fun. I mean, I'll be first in line. I'd be so excited.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jane. Great.